Good evening and welcome. Imagine a world where the Roman Empire never fell, a world where the marble columns of Rome still rise majestically over a vast, united empire. Today, we are going to explore this intriguing what-if scenario. What if the political stability of Rome had been preserved, preventing the collapse that history recorded? In this alternate timeline, the empire's centralized government adapts successfully to internal challenges, balancing the ambitions of generals, senators, and distant provincial governors. Corruption is managed more effectively, and civil wars that historically weakened Rome are either avoided or resolved quickly. Without fragmentation, the empire maintains control over its far-reaching borders from the windswept hills of Britannia to the deserts of Egypt. Such stability would not only secure Rome's territory but also foster a thriving economy. Where trade routes remain uninterrupted, cities grow, and infrastructure projects flourish. Roads, aqueducts, and ports continue to expand, creating a connected world unlike anything we know today. Citizens and subjects alike experience a consistent rule of law, while cultural exchange spreads Latin, Roman traditions, and innovations more uniformly across the continents. As we delve deeper, consider the ripple effects this sustained empire might have had. The development of technology, governance, religion, and even the map of the modern world could look completely different. Could the Roman way of life have shaped a global civilization centuries ahead of its time? Let us journey back to a Rome that never fell and imagine the possibilities that unfold when one of history's greatest empires holds the reins of power for centuries longer than it ever did. With political stability secure, the Roman Empire would have had the resources and continuity to push technological and engineering advancements far beyond what we know from history. Roads, aqueducts, and bridges that once connected the empire could evolve into even more sophisticated networks, allowing faster travel and communication across continents. Imagine innovations in construction, perhaps early versions of mechanical cranes, more advanced concrete, or even rudimentary forms of water-powered machinery spreading across the empire. The Roman focus on infrastructure and urban planning could lead to cities with more complex sewage systems, public amenities, and public transportation decades or even centuries earlier than in our timeline. Military technology would also see accelerated progress. Weapons, fortifications, and naval engineering could develop faster, potentially giving Rome unprecedented defensive and offensive capabilities. The knowledge of metallurgy, hydraulics, and architecture might advance in parallel with these military needs, driving a kind of proto-industrial revolution long before the modern era. This earlier technological growth would not just stay within Rome, it could influence the provinces, from Gaul to Mesopotamia, shaping societies that, in our timeline, remained technologically less connected. Cultural exchange combined with engineering innovation would foster a unique world where the pace of progress is dramatically faster, potentially changing the way science, trade, and everyday life evolved for centuries. In this world, we might live in a reality where machines, roads, and cities developed centuries ahead of schedule, all because the empire never fell. With the empire remaining politically stable and technologically advanced, Roman culture and law would likely spread more deeply and more widely than ever before. Latin, once the language of administration and literature, could become a global lingua franca centuries earlier, influencing not only Europe but also Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. Scholars, merchants, and officials across the empire would communicate in a shared language, creating a level of cultural cohesion rarely seen in history. Roman law, with its focus on property, contracts, and civic rights, would become the backbone of societies far beyond Italy. Courts, legal codes, and administrative systems could standardize governance across vast territories, providing consistency that might prevent rebellions and local power struggles. Citizens would experience a predictable and enforceable rule of law, which could encourage trade, investment, and cultural growth on an unprecedented scale. Culturally, art, literature, and architecture would flourish across the empire. Cities would showcase Roman styles of temples, amphitheaters, and forums, creating a recognizable aesthetic from Londinium in the north to Alexandria in the south. Festivals, customs, and religious practices shaped by Rome would unify the populace, fostering a shared identity across continents. Over time, this dominance could make the Roman worldview the default perspective for centuries, shaping philosophy, politics, and education globally. Imagine a world where Latin phrases, Roman principles, and imperial customs remain the norm, centuries ahead of their historical spread, where the Roman imprint on humanity is not just a chapter in history books, but the foundation of modern civilization itself. A world where the Roman Empire never fell could have dramatically changed the trajectory of religion, particularly Christianity. In our history, the collapse of Rome and the rise of smaller kingdoms allowed Christianity to grow from a persecuted sect to a dominant global faith. But in a stable and enduring empire, the dynamics could be very different. Without the chaos and fragmentation that followed Rome's fall, the traditional Roman pantheon of gods and civic cults might remain influential, limiting Christianity's spread. The empire's political and cultural unity could suppress radical religious movements, favoring established religious practices tied to Roman identity. Christianity might still exist, but as a minor sect alongside Roman state religion rather than the world-changing force it became. Alternatively, if the empire adopted Christianity more gradually or selectively, the religion could evolve differently, shaped by the empire's centralized authority. Doctrines, rituals, and the church hierarchy might be structured in ways more closely aligned with imperial governance, creating a faith that emphasizes civic duty and loyalty to the empire as much as spiritual devotion. This shift would not only affect religious practice but also art, philosophy, and the law. Symbols, holidays, and moral codes influenced by Christianity might be far less dominant, replaced by values reflecting Roman ideals of citizenship, discipline, and civic honor. Imagine a modern world where Christianity never became the defining cultural force of Europe and the Americas, where Roman ideals guided society, instead an alternate spiritual landscape shaped entirely by a Rome that never fell. If the Roman Empire had maintained its stability for centuries, the political map of Europe would look completely different today. The formation of modern nation-states France, England, Germany, Spain, and others was largely a result of the empire's collapse. Without that fragmentation, a single Roman authority might have persisted across the continent, preventing the rise of individual kingdoms and empires. A united Europe under Rome would have meant centralized governance, uniform law, and coordinated defense across vast territories. Local rulers and feudal lords would have had less power, replaced by provincial governors accountable to the imperial center. Borders would be defined by administrative regions rather than national identities, and local conflicts might be resolved through Roman legal systems instead of warfare. Cultural identity would also be transformed. Instead of multiple, distinct languages, traditions, and customs, Latin and Roman culture would dominate daily life, education, and governance. Shared infrastructure and trade networks would connect distant regions seamlessly, creating an economic and social cohesion unparalleled in history. Even modern concepts of democracy and nationalism could look entirely different. Without independent states, wars over territory or resources might be fewer, replaced by internal reforms and political debates within a single empire. Europe might become a continent bound by law, engineering, and shared heritage rather than centuries of fragmented rivalries. In this world, the very idea of Europe as a collection of nations could be unimaginable, replaced by a continuous Roman identity stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Black Sea, shaping society in ways that would ripple across centuries. With a stable and enduring Roman Empire, the exploration and colonization of distant lands could have happened centuries earlier than in our timeline. Roman seafarers, driven by the empire's need for resources, trade, and expansion, might have ventured across the Atlantic long before the Age of Discovery. Imagine Roman fleets navigating to the Americas, guided by their advanced engineering and navigation knowledge. Cities, settlements, and Roman-style infrastructure could be established along coastlines and rivers, bringing roads, aqueducts, and organized governance to lands previously untouched by European influence. Trade networks might connect the Old World and the New World much earlier, exchanging goods, ideas, and technologies on a global scale. The cultural and political consequences would be profound. Indigenous civilizations might face Roman law, governance, and military tactics centuries before European contact occurred in our history. Latin could spread across continents, along with Roman customs, architecture, and religious practices, fundamentally reshaping societies in the Americas. Moreover, technological and agricultural knowledge from Rome could transform local economies, cities, and urban planning, potentially avoiding some of the upheavals and collapses experienced in our timeline. The Americas, under Roman influence, might become centers of innovation and trade long before the modern era, creating a world where the global balance of power is entirely different. In this alternate reality, the age of exploration as we know it never happens. The Romans had already mapped, conquered, and civilized continents, leaving a legacy that reshapes global history in ways we can only begin to imagine. Now, let us imagine the Cold War did not remain cold. A direct military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union would have unleashed unprecedented destruction. Both superpowers had vast armies, advanced weapons, and nuclear arsenals poised for conflict. Even a limited engagement could have resulted in millions of casualties within weeks, far exceeding any conventional war in human history. Cities would become battlegrounds, and civilian populations, often unprepared for large-scale attacks, would face devastating consequences. Infrastructure critical for daily life, electricity, transportation, water supply could collapse, plunging societies into chaos. Hospitals, schools, and communication systems would be overwhelmed, leaving communities struggling to survive amid the chaos of war. The psychological impact would be immense. Entire generations would grow up with trauma, fear, and uncertainty as part of everyday life. Governments might impose martial law, curfews, and strict rationing, further changing the way people live, work, and interact. Political leaders would face unimaginable pressure to respond quickly, with any miscalculation risking even greater catastrophe. Even if nuclear weapons were avoided initially, conventional warfare on this scale would reshape the geopolitical map. Borders could shift dramatically, alliances would fracture, and neutral nations might be drawn into the conflict to protect their interests. The world order, carefully maintained through decades of tension, could collapse in months, leaving a globe scarred by violence and uncertainty. This is the terrifying reality of a Cold War turned hot, a scenario where human civilization teeters on the edge, demonstrating how fragile peace can be when two superpowers face off. If tensions escalated further, the use of nuclear weapons would be almost inevitable. Even a limited exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union could trigger catastrophic loss of life, instantly obliterating cities and leaving millions dead in an instant. The immediate destruction would be horrifying, but the consequences would ripple far beyond the battlefield. Nuclear detonations release massive amounts of radiation, contaminating land, water, and air for decades. Survivors would face long-term health problems, including cancer, genetic mutations, and chronic illnesses. Entire regions could become uninhabitable, forcing mass migrations and triggering humanitarian crises on a global scale. The environmental impact would be equally devastating. Massive fires from nuclear strikes could inject soot into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and potentially causing a nuclear winter. Crops would fail, leading to widespread famine, and ecosystems could collapse under the combined weight of radiation, fire, and climate disruption. Ocean currents and weather patterns might shift unpredictably, affecting regions far from the initial conflict. Even nations not directly involved would feel the consequences. Trade would collapse, economies would falter, and international cooperation could break down under the strain of global disaster. Civilization as we know it could be fundamentally altered, and the recovery process might take generations if humanity survived at all. This terrifying scenario illustrates the true stakes of the Cold War. What began as a geopolitical standoff could easily have escalated into a global catastrophe, showing just how fragile peace can be in a nuclear age. A full-scale Cold War conflict would not just devastate the superpowers, it would radically reshape the global political map. Nations caught between the United States and the Soviet Union could be forced to pick sides or risk annihilation, and alliances we take for granted today might crumble overnight. Traditional borders could dissolve under the pressure of military occupation, rebellion, or negotiated treaties born from desperate survival. Some countries might vanish entirely, swallowed by stronger powers or fragmented by internal uprisings sparked by war. Others could shift allegiances multiple times, depending on which side appeared stronger at any given moment. Small and medium-sized nations would face impossible choices: align with one superpower, attempt neutrality, or endure occupation. Their sovereignty could become a temporary illusion in a world dominated by military might. Even historically stable regions could experience upheaval. Europe, Asia, and the Middle East might see new borders drawn based on military control rather than historical, cultural, or ethnic lines. Former alliances, such as NATO or the Warsaw Pact, could fracture as member nations reassess their survival strategies. The unpredictability of such shifts would create a chaotic geopolitical landscape. Maps drawn before the war would be useless afterward, and nations might rise or disappear entirely in ways no historian could have predicted. This volatile scenario highlights how a Cold War turned hot could rewrite the rules of global politics, leaving the world forever changed in both expected and unimaginable ways. In a Cold War that turned hot, the pressures of total war would accelerate technological development at an unprecedented pace. Both the United States and the Soviet Union, desperate to gain any advantage, would invest massively in weapons research, creating innovations far ahead of their time. Advanced missiles, surveillance systems, and defensive technologies would emerge rapidly, driven by the immediate need to survive and outmatch the enemy. Military strategy would fuel breakthroughs in aviation, naval, and ground warfare. Planes capable of higher speeds and longer ranges, tanks with superior armor, and ships equipped with cutting-edge weaponry could appear decades earlier than they did in our timeline. Even communication and encryption technologies would advance under the pressure of securing sensitive information on a global battlefield. This acceleration would not be limited to military applications. Innovations could spill over into civilian sectors, transforming energy systems, computing, medicine, and manufacturing. Nuclear research, radar, and rocketry could evolve at an astonishing rate, reshaping society's understanding of science and engineering. However, the human cost of such progress would be immense. Each technological leap would be forged through conflict, testing, and devastation. Entire cities and populations could become laboratories of survival, where failure is measured in lives lost. The rapid pace of change would create a world simultaneously more advanced and more dangerous, demonstrating the stark reality that some innovations are born out of necessity, desperation, and conflict. This scenario reveals how a hot Cold War could have not only reshaped global politics but also propelled humanity into a technological future far sooner than anyone anticipated at a devastating cost. A full-scale Cold War conflict would not only devastate nations physically but also send shockwaves through the global economy. Trade routes would collapse as ports, railways, and roads are destroyed or controlled by military forces. Industries dependent on international cooperation, manufacturing, agriculture, energy would face massive disruptions, leading to shortages of essential goods worldwide. Financial markets, already fragile in times of tension, could experience historic crashes. Currencies might lose value rapidly, inflation could soar, and nations could default on debt as war expenditures overwhelm their economies. International cooperation, trade agreements, and global supply chains would unravel, creating economic chaos even in countries far from the battlefield. Resource scarcity would become a defining issue. Fuel, food, and raw materials could be rationed or redirected to military production, leaving civilians struggling to survive. Nations may be forced to restructure their economies entirely, prioritizing wartime production over civilian needs. New economic powers could emerge from previously minor players who control key resources, while historically dominant economies might collapse under strain. The societal impact of economic collapse would be profound. Mass unemployment, poverty, and famine could destabilize regions for decades, and recovery would take generations. Governments might impose strict controls over production, labor, and distribution, reshaping society in ways unimaginable under normal circumstances. This scenario illustrates that the cost of a Cold War turned hot extends far beyond the battlefield. Global systems, livelihoods, and the very structure of economic power would be forever altered. Beyond the devastation and economic collapse, a hot Cold War would have fundamentally reshaped societies and cultures worldwide. With survival as the central priority, daily life would revolve around food, shelter, and safety, leaving little room for art, education, or leisure. Generations growing up under such conditions would adopt values of resilience, pragmatism, and resourcefulness far earlier than in our timeline. Cultural norms and social structures could shift dramatically. Communities might become tightly organized around mutual aid and protection, while traditional hierarchies or political systems break down under the pressure of war. Education could be redirected toward practical skills necessary for survival and wartime industry, rather than philosophy, literature, or the arts. Social cohesion might strengthen within local populations, but broader international cultural exchange could stagnate or vanish entirely. War would also influence identity and ideology. Nationalism, loyalty to military leaders, and ideological propaganda could dominate public consciousness, shaping literature, music, and media to reinforce survival-focused priorities. Rituals, celebrations, and cultural institutions might be minimized or adapted to suit wartime conditions. Even after hostilities ended, the long-term effects would persist. The collective trauma, loss of life, and disrupted cultural development would leave a generation shaped by hardship. Societies would rebuild differently, prioritizing defense, security, and practical innovation over creativity and exploration. This scenario demonstrates that a Cold War turned hot would not just change borders or economies, it could reshape the very fabric of human culture, values, and identity, leaving a world fundamentally different from the one we know today. As we have explored today, imagining a world where the Roman Empire never fell or the Cold War escalated into a full-scale conflict reveals just how fragile and contingent history truly is. One empire's survival could have accelerated technology, reshaped culture, and rewritten the map of the modern world, while one geopolitical misstep in the 20th century could have plunged humanity into catastrophic destruction, altering societies and economies beyond recognition. These what-if scenarios remind us that history is not inevitable. Small changes, decisions, or moments of stability can ripple across centuries, creating worlds both astonishing and terrifying. They invite us to think critically about the forces that have shaped our present and to appreciate the delicate balance of politics, culture, and human ingenuity that allows civilization to thrive. History, as it happened, is only one version of countless possibilities. By imagining the paths not taken, we gain a deeper understanding of our world and the incredible complexity of human events. Thank you for joining me on this journey into alternate history and curious possibilities. If you enjoyed today's exploration, do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more intriguing mysteries from the past, present, and what could have been.